Thanks for coming. Tonight we're going to take a little journey back in time to a time when local and national politics were in turmoil over social issues, slavery in particular. Fights would break out in Congress, and one senator was nearly beaten to death by a fellow congressman. The question was always, what should be done about the slaves? Should they be set free? As we know, the issue eventually led to a civil war in this country, resulting in over 700,000 deaths and 4 million slaves being set free. The road to freedom for the black man was a rocky and curvy one, and some would say that journey has not yet ended. So here we find ourselves on April 14, 1865, as President Lincoln shares his views regarding that journey. Please join me in welcoming President Abraham Lincoln.
Good evening. I want to thank Colonel Clayton and Captain Batzlaw for being here this evening to make sure everything goes correctly. I bring greetings to all of you from Washington City, from your two senators, Zachariah Chandler and Jacob Howard. I must confess that Chandler and I are not on the best of terms. He often thinks he's the biggest toad in the puddle. However, Jacob Howard is a man that I deeply respect. While Chandler stands on the floor of the Senate and beats his chest and talks about all the things we should be doing, Jacob Howard is behind the scenes getting work done. And it's because of him that I can say thank God for Michigan a second time. The first time, some of you may recall, was back in May of '61 when the first Michigan troops marched into Washington City to help protect the Capitol. When I received that news, I said, thank God for Michigan, because then I knew that the western states would support the cause. Well, 2 years ago, I issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I knew that future presidents could rescind that order. So I wanted a permanent law. And thanks to the efforts of Jacob Howard, that law passed, becoming the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in this country. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Well, I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, February 12th, 1809. Thomas Jefferson was the president at that time, and we had 17 states in our country, all of them east of the Mississippi River. West was all wild country. Some folks say it still is. But here now it's 1865. We now have 36 states in our country. We go as far west now as California. Some folks wonder why we have a state that far away. It takes 6 months by wagon train to get there. And that's from St. Joe, Missouri. Our newest state is Nevada. Just signed the bill for that last fall. with some hesitancy, I might add. It could be a big gamble letting those people into the county. Time will tell about that. And between here and California, there's a lot of wide open territory. Every year there's hundreds of families moving out there to settle that land. And I wouldn't be surprised if the day comes when all that territory gets divided up into states. We could have as many as 50 states someday. It won't happen in my lifetime, but perhaps in yours, if that happens. Well, speaking of states, California came into the Union in 1850. And I remember that so well because of the battles that were fought in Congress over admitting California to the Union. You see, California wanted to come in as a free state. Well, we had 30 states at the time, 15 slave states, and 15 free states. That was not an accident. You see, back in 1820, when Missouri wanted entrance into as a state, it was a slave state. It wanted to come in as a slave state. Well, the northern free soilers didn't like that. So there was a lot of discussion, you see, and a compromise was developed, known as the Missouri Compromise. For each slave state that would come into the Union, a free state would come in, or vice versa. And there would be no slaves allowed in the territories. Well, that precedent was set earlier with the Northwest Territory, but it was meant, that compromise was meant to maintain a balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate. A representative from New York had introduced an amendment to the bill that would enable Missouri to become a state. And although he was a Democrat, he proposed to prohibit bringing any more slaves into Missouri and to grant freedom to the children of slaves that were born within the state after it was admitted. Well, this disturbed the South because slave labor was now making cotton growing an increasingly profitable industry. Well, the free states controlled the House. And so the South thought if they could maintain an even balance in the other House, that would be good. So the amendment passed the House, but it failed in the Senate. Well, during the next session, Maine made application to come in as a state, a free state. So now the balance could be maintained. Maine, a free state, Missouri, a slave state. And the compromise could now be possible. The bill was adopted by Congress in 1821. It banned slavery in the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri, except Missouri. So the people of Missouri wrote into their Constitution a clause forbidding any free blacks or mulattoes to enter their state. Well, in order for Missouri to be accepted into the Union, Congress said a second compromise would be necessary. In order for Missouri to come in, the legislators of that state could not deny black citizens of the United States their constitutional rights, which meant they could go freely from state to state. Well, if we go back a few years to 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was being held in Philadelphia, slavery was a big issue discussed among the delegates that summer. What to do about it? They all knew slavery was wrong. But we all know that knowing something is wrong and doing something about it are entirely two different things. Of the 13 states, 12 were slave states. Now suppose that these delegates put a clause in the Constitution prohibiting slavery in the country. What are the odds of that Constitution being ratified? 2, slim, and none. So they compromised. They said that there would be no slave trade 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution. And there would be no slavery in the territories. And this is very important, the issue of slavery in the several states would be decided by the states. Each state would decide for themselves what to do about the slavery question. Well, eventually all of the northern states prohibited slavery, the southern states did not. But the federal government would have jurisdiction over the slavery in the territories. So the Northwest Ordinance, passed in 1787, no slavery allowed in the northwest of the territory. Now, in case some of you are wondering where the Northwest Territory is, there were 5 states developed out of the Northwest Territory. Can anybody here name one of them?
Michigan.
Michigan was one of them, yes.
Indiana.
Indiana was another. Ohio. Illinois. Wisconsin. Yes. That was the Northwest Territory. Now I bring that up because I know there are probably some in here that when they think Northwest Territory, they're thinking Oregon, the Washington Territory, the Montana Territory. No, that you're in the Northwest Territory. So there'd be no slavery here. So California wants in as a free state. Debate in Congress. Those men argued and argued and argued, and finally 2 senators, Henry Clay from Kentucky and Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, put together a series of compromises that would allow California statehood, because there were no slave states ready to come in. And the southern slaveholders were really afraid that by letting California in, that would break that power balance, and they'd eventually lose their property. Well, so in return for California coming into the Union, the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided for the return of slaves who ran away to the free territory. And a few years later, Congress passed a fugitive slave law which allowed owners to recover their slaves merely by presenting proof of ownership before a magistrate. A warrant would then be issued, and the runaway slave would be arrested and returned to the owner. Now, the escaped slave would have no jury trial and no right to give evidence on his own behalf. Under this law, there were a number of free blacks in the northern states who were kidnapped and taken south into slavery. And for that reason, some of the northern states gave orders not to give any aid to the fugitive to recover the fugitive slaves. So, in the Compromise of 1850, the fugitive slave law being strengthened meant that heavy penalties would be imposed on people who aided a slave's escape or hindered the recovery of those slaves. And the jurisdiction was changed from local courts to federal courts. Now you might think, so what? Well, the local courts, the local judges, were sympathetic to the runaways. The federal courts were sympathetic to the slave owners. So, this was done. Both parties thought that this would solve the problem of the slavery issue. And it did, for 4 years. Then in 1854, Stephen Douglas pushes through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed the territories themselves to decide whether they would be slave or free. Douglas referred to this as popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. Sound good? Let the people decide. Well, yeah, that's good. Sometimes. Well, for example, say that a group of people in your community gets together and they've been having some conversation and they decide that you need a new courthouse. But where does the money come from to build that courthouse? From the people, correct? Say yes. Yes. Just want to see if you're still awake. And so the group of people gets it put on the ballot for the people to vote, popular sovereignty, on the issue of whether or not to build to provide the funds to build a new courthouse. If the people say yes, you get a new courthouse. If the people say no, you don't. That's popular sovereignty. Works pretty good. But what about moral issues? Issues of right and wrong. Do we have the right to tell someone that they have permission to do wrong? See, everybody knows slavery's wrong, whether they're willing to admit it or not. They know slavery's wrong. Stephen Douglas did not care whether slavery was voted up or voted down. If he did care, he would not have pushed that bill through Congress. He wouldn't have done it. You don't have to leave on my account, ma'am. No? But, no? Do we have the right to give permission to somebody to do wrong? Now, I was talking about this with some students a short time back, and they didn't seem to quite understand this. So I brought up the idea that, you know, I really don't like bald-headed people. And I think they should be eliminated from the face of the earth. And if I get enough people to support me, and we get it put on the ballot, and I convince enough people to vote yes on eliminating bald-headed people, then we can get rid of them. Well, they didn't think that was right. I said, well, that's popular sovereignty. See? Oh, so we have to be very careful with moral issues. Well, when I left Congress in 1849, I got out of politics. But this issue got me back in. I went around Illinois and Missouri and Ohio, and I made a lot of speeches against this Kansas-Nebraska Bill. And in 1856, I ran for the Senate in Illinois and lost. And then in 1857, there was the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. Dred Scott, a slave in Missouri, was taken by his owner to live in Illinois and Wisconsin for a period of time, and then they went back to Missouri, and he eventually filed suit against his owner, declaring that since he lived in free states for a period of time, he was now a free man. Well, without going into a lot of the details, the case eventually got to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court handed down its decision saying that the black man, free or slave, had no rights that the white man was bound to respect because he was not a citizen of this country. Yeah. And not being a citizen, he cannot file suit in a federal court. And then the court went further. The court said that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. And slaveholders had the right to take their slaves anywhere they wanted to take them. So the court could have simply dismissed the case after ruling on Scott's citizenship. But there was a growing national desire for a ruling on the constitutionality of such laws as the Missouri Compromise. And the court ruled that the compromise was unconstitutional. And Chief Justice Taney argued that because slaves are property, Congress could not forbid slavery in the territories without violating a slave owner's right to own property. So if a slave owner can take his property anywhere he wants to go, he can take his slaves anywhere he wants them to go. That gave rise to the speech that I gave the following year in 1858, when I was encouraged by my friends to run for the Senate to take Stephen Douglas's seat. In my acceptance speech, I said this: a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, north as well as south. You see, because of the Dred Scott decision, if you are a slave owner in, say, Kentucky, and you hear about this good farmland up in Michigan, you sell your farm in Kentucky because the land is being depleted, and you take your slaves and you go north up to Michigan, and you buy some good farmland up there, and you have a good year. So then you write a letter to your friends in Kentucky and say, hey, the land up here is wonderful, come on up. So they do. What does Michigan eventually become? A slave state. That's what I meant when I said the advocates will push it forward until it becomes alike lawful in all the states, north as well as south. Because now the Supreme Court had declared that the slave owners can take their slaves anywhere they want, and the federal government cannot prohibit slavery in the territories. So, Douglass and I go around the state and we have these debates. And we argued the question of slavery back and forth, and he made a lot of accusations, not the least of which he called me a two-faced man. He did. And I looked at the audience and I said, now, if I had two faces, would I be wearing this one? And in one of the last debates, I said to him, let me ask why they, meaning the founding fathers, the writers of the Constitution, why they made provision that the source of slavery, the African slave trade, should be cut off at the end of 20 years. Why did they make provision that in all the new territory that we owned at the time, slavery should be forever prohibited? Why stop its spread in one direction and cut off its source in another if they did not look to being placed in the course of ultimate extinction? Well, of course, Stephen Douglas won the Senate seat. He retained his Senate seat because the Democrats had a majority in the state legislature. But as a result of those debates, people all over the country knew of these debates because of something called the Telegraph. How many here have ever sent a telegraph message? That many? How many have ever received one? That many? Well, I'm going to tell you something. When this war began, well, the first time I saw a telegraph was in 1857 in Beacon, Illinois. I walked into a hotel there, and a young man was over in the corner operating one of these telegraph keys. And I had never seen one. I had heard about it, so I went over there and I talked to him, and I asked him a lot of questions about how it operated and so on and so forth. Well, then I get elected to the presidency, and the first year, I didn't use the telegraph much. I think I sent maybe 8 or 9 messages. Part of that was because McClellan, George General, he kind of hoarded the telegraph. After the war started, Congress voted to expand telegraph use, and they put up telegraph lines all over around the White House. And then didn't put an office in the White House. I'm the commander-in-chief. So that means I had to walk over to the War Department every day to check the telegraph messages. But it wasn't until 1862 that I really got the idea of how useful a telegraph was, how fast it is, how quickly messages could be. It's a lot faster than a courier, I'll tell you that. I mean, I've got armies, generals all over the country. For example, down in New Orleans, General Butler, down there. And that's 1,000 miles from Washington, you know. If I send a courier down there, a man could grow a beard waiting for an answer to come back. With Telegraph, I'm glad you're sitting down because you're not going to believe this. With Telegraph, I can send a message to General Butler and get a reply back in minutes. Not days or weeks, but minutes. And not only that, my cipher boys assured me that I can send a given message to several generals at the same time with Telegraph. Now, Major Eckert is in charge of the Telegraph office, and he and I were having a conversation recently, and I said, you know, I've been really impressed with this invention, Telegraph. And I expect when this war is over and we return the Telegraph to civilian control, when the general population learns about it, the day will come when everyone who wants one will have their own telegraph key and will be able to send and receive messages anytime they wish. Now, I hear some of you laughing. You don't think it's going to happen, but I think it won't happen in my lifetime, but perhaps yours. Well, they learned about, the people learned about these debates, and they learned my attitude and my feelings about slavery, which was important in 1860. But in 1859, Kansas was getting hot. Free soilers versus the slaveholders. The slaveholders were moving into Kansas because they wanted fertile land. The land where they were was being depleted. And the free soilers didn't want that Kansas to become a slave state like Missouri. And so both sides were moving there in droves. You think they were friendly to one another? No, it didn't get to be called Bleeding Kansas for nothing. And then there was John Brown. The man had the right idea, but not the right way to go about it. He was just a little bit nuts. And he eventually paid for it, of course, by being hanged for attacking federal property. But in 1860, in the presidential election, there were 4 candidates. I won the nomination for the Republicans. Stephen Douglass, remember him? Kansas-Nebraska Bill. He won the nomination for the Northern Democrats. John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and then John Bell was the candidate for the Constitutional Union Party. And the South threatened secession because it looked like I was going to win, because the Democrats were split. The Constitutional Union Party was not much, didn't have much strength. And the Democrats were split. Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, so it really opened the door for me to win the election. And so the South was so afraid. They had people running around all over the place saying, if Lincoln gets elected, he's going to take away your slaves. Never mind that the Constitution says who's in charge of slavery in the states? The states are, not the federal government. You see, the Republican platform in 1860 stated we are against the advancement of slavery in the territories. And we promised not to touch it in the states where it already exists. But still, there were those people who were running around telling people, don't vote for Lincoln, he'll take your slaves away. Now, I would challenge anybody in this room or elsewhere to find a speech, name a speech or any document that I wrote, any speech that I gave where I attacked or declared war on slavery in the states. You won't find one. Never did I say, if I'm elected president, I will get rid of slavery in the states where it already exists. Never once. Because I know the law, I know the Constitution. I don't have that power. How many people in this room have ever made a decision? Everybody better raise their hand. Now, you all know that decisions have consequences. Some decisions have little bitty consequences. Other decisions have big consequences. So you have to really be careful and do a lot of thinking before making a final decision. So I get elected president. Eventually, 11 states, slave states in the South, take action to leave the Union. Based on what? Something that I never said I would do, but they thought I might. Would you make a major decision on such flimsy evidence? No, you wouldn't, not if you're sane. But they did. And so, after my inauguration in March of 1861, a day or two later, I get this report from Colonel Anderson of Fort Sumter, saying they were running out of supplies, especially food. And if they don't get supplies pretty soon, they're going to either starve to death or have to give up the fort. So I had meetings with my cabinet, and we discussed it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Eventually, the decision was made to resupply the fort. So a ship was outfitted, loaded with supplies. On April 6, 1861, I sent a messenger to Charleston, South Carolina, to meet with Governor Pickens and read to him this message. I am directed by the President of the United States to notify you to expect an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only. And that, if such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice, or in the case of an attack upon the fort. I didn't have to send that message to Governor Pickens, but I thought I'd be courteous to him and send it. So what did Pickens do? He sent that message to a fellow by the name of Jefferson Davis, who was elected president of the so-called Confederate States of America. Now, Jefferson Davis had made the statement that all we want is to be left alone. Yet when he got that message and he discussed it with his advisors, what was his reply to Governor Pickens? Fire on the fort. Did he really want to be left alone? Yeah. So they fired on the fort, and the war began. Now, I'm fighting two wars. I'm fighting the rebels in the South, and I'm fighting the radicals in the North, who wanted emancipation yesterday. They really, really wanted emancipation badly, without any thought of what we're going to do with all those freed slaves once we get them free. They had no plan. So I'm dealing with these two issues. And one of the plans that I had was gradual, compensated emancipation. I figured that it would be cheaper, less expensive for the federal government to pay the slave owners for their slaves and set them free than to fight this war. And of course, we've got the 4 border states who are slave states that stayed with the United States, but their leaders wouldn't go along with any of the plans that I had. Wouldn't go along. And so I said, okay, then we're going to do it militarily. Now remember, what do the Southern slaveholders consider their slaves to be? Property. Property. During wartime, what does each side in the fight try to do to the other side to help them win the war? You confiscate property, you destroy property, you steal it, you do whatever you can to weaken your enemy so that you can win the war. Okay, so eventually I was convinced that one of the ways we're going to be able to win this war is if we do something about the property of the slave owners in their slaves. Because while their men are off fighting the war, the slaves are home doing the work. Take away the workforce, it changes the picture. So I wrote a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. I read it to my cabinet on July 22nd, 1862. Not to get their advice as to whether or not we should issue it. I said, we're going to issue it. The question is when. Well, Secretary Seward said, you know, we haven't been doing very well on the battlefield. If you issue that thing now, it's going to look like a last gasp effort to win this war. Wait until we have a victory. Now this is July 22nd. Next month, August, I get a letter from Horace Greeley. Now it wasn't a private letter. It was a letter to me that he published in his newspaper, the New York, the name escapes me now. But anyway, so the whole country could see it. The prayer of 20 millions. And he was criticizing me for not doing enough on emancipation. Of course, he didn't know that I had that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation already written and ready to issue. But on August 22nd, I replied to him saying, you know, my primary purpose here is to preserve the Union. If I can preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I will do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and not others, I will do that. And if I can preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, I will do that. But always keeping in mind that besides everything else, it is my desire that all men everywhere should be free. Well, September comes. We've gone 6 weeks now, no Union victory yet. But September 17th, Sharpsburg, Maryland, Antietam Creek. Bloodiest day in American history. The fighting was over that day. There were over 20,000 casualties in one day. McClellan's forces prevented Lee's forces from advancing further into Maryland. So it was enough of a victory that on the 22nd of September, I issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring that in 100 days, on January the 1st, all slaves in states and parts of states still in rebellion against the federal government would be forever free. That was an incentive, I hoped, for states to give up the fight, come back into the fold, give up this fight to keep their slavery. But none of them did, of course. And on January 1st, 1863, I signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so now the slaves would be free. And in January of 1865, just earlier this year, Congress, with the help of your Senator Jacob Howard, passed a bill that, if adopted by the states, will become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and we will have no more slavery in this country forever. And for that, I say thank God for Michigan a second time. Well, I'll tell you, oh my, I promised Mary I'd be home. Well, see, I promised to take her to a play tonight. Laura Keene is giving her final performance tonight in a play called Our American Cousin over at Ford's Theater, so I expect it's going to be a memorable evening, and I don't want to miss it. However, before I depart, I would be happy to answer a question or two if there are any. If there's anybody still awake. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Where am I from originally? Well, I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. Then I grew up in Indiana, and then I lived in Illinois. And I'm presently housed at the Executive Mansion in Washington City.
You say Missouri and Missouri.
That's because it's pronounced both ways, depending on where you're from. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Question. As a proud graduate of Lincoln High School from Vincennes, Indiana.
They named a high school after me?
They did. They did. And I grew up along the Lincoln Trail. Your move from Kentucky through Indiana into Illinois.
Yep, went through Vincennes.
You did. And you saw your first printing press there.
Yep. Almost lost my dog there too. Well, it was cold, and we were going across this river, and the dog fell into the water.
My question was if you would reflect on your time in southern Indiana as a child, as
How
a
much time
young
do you
boy
have?
growing up.
Well, I'll tell you what, growing up in southern Indiana was not fun. When we moved there in December of 1816, it was wintertime. It was cold. There were no roads to speak of. We had to cut our way through the forest to get to the land that my father purchased. We built a lean-to hut to sleep in that winter. It's an open-faced thing. Big fire there to keep the wild animals away and to give us a little warmth. And then the following spring we commenced to build a regular log cabin, but we had to clear land to plant crops. We had to grow our own food because there were no stores to go to buy food. So we had to grow our own food, and then we had to hunt and to fish and so on. And so much of our time was spent just getting enough food to eat that I had hardly any time to go to school. That's why I'm surprised they named the school. I mean, my sister Sarah and I went to school by littles, a little bit here and a little bit there. If you add up all the time that I went to school, it's less than 1 year. I had to do most of my learning by reading books. I love to read books. I learned about people I'd never met, places I'd never been, just by reading books. And learned about my favorite president by reading books, George Washington. I walked 4 miles to borrow a book about George Washington. I got it home, and I'd read a little bit of it every night, and I stored the book in a little crack between 2 logs in the wall of our house. And that worked pretty good till one night we got a heavy rain. And you know what happened to that book? Ever try to read a book with pages that are wet? So now my father made me walk back to that farm and return the book and offer to pay for it, which I did by shucking corn for 3 days. Anybody here ever shuck corn? You know what I'm talking about. My hands were sore, but then he let me keep the book. But it was one of my memories of southern Indiana is a very sad one because it was about 2 years after we got there. The land was good, produced good crops and everything, but a lot of other people were moving in, and some of my mother's relatives came to live close by, the Sparrows, and one day they got sick. And of course, in the wilderness, there's no hospitals. The closest doctor was 40 miles away. We had to make up our own medicines. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. And we had to take care of each other, so my mother went over there to help them. Well, of course, we didn't know what was causing the sickness. As it turned out, it was the white snake root plant. It's called the milk sick because the cows would eat that plant and it was toxic for them, so they'd get sick. People drank the milk from the cow, they'd get sick, and it was nearly always fatal. So the Sparrows died, and my mother got sick, and she died. I was 9 years old. My sister was 11. That was in October of 1818. And it was very, very sad time. It really broke out our hearts because we loved our mother very much. And it was a lonely winter in that cabin without her. We missed her cooking for sure, because she was a good cook. And her laughter, and her hugs every night before I went to bed. And meanwhile, the work goes on, the chores need to be done, and now my sister and I had our mother's chores to do as well as our own, and it wasn't working very good for 2 young children. Our father could see very plainly we needed a mother. So the next year he went back to Kentucky, where we used to live, and there was a woman there he used to know named Sarah Bush Johnston. She was a widow. Her husband died, left her with 3 children to take care of, and they needed a father. So my father went to her house in Elizabethtown, and he knocked on her door, and she opened it, and he said, "Howdy, Sarah, want to get married?" He was so romantic. She said no. Well, it seems that when her husband died, she was left with a lot of bills to pay, and she didn't think it was proper for a woman to marry a man and then expect him to pay her bills. But he was desperate. He needed a mother for his children, and so he said, I've got the money, I can pay the bills. So he did, and they got married. And sold her cabin, and loaded everything up in the wagons, and moved across the Ohio River to our one-room cabin in Indiana. It was crowded. But even though I still missed my angel mother, I grew to love my stepmother very much. She was a very kindly woman, treated me like her own son, and she was a good cook too. Well, for a growing boy, that's important. Of course it is, yes. So I have both sad and happy memories of the time in southern Indiana. Hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Yes.
Have you ever traveled outside the U.S., sir?
Have I ever what?
Traveled outside the U.S.
Have I ever trampled outside the U.S.? Not that I can recall. I know that Mary and I, after I'm finished with the presidency, we're planning a trip to Israel. Like to visit the Holy Land. So that's on our list to do. Haven't left the country yet. Although you might consider, I went to the Wisconsin Territory, that was still part of the United States. See, in 1832, I joined the Illinois militia to be part of the Black Hawk Indian War, and we went to Wisconsin. And Wisconsin at that time was still a territory, but it's still part of the U.S., so that doesn't count. It's trampling outside the U.S. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Could you share any of your personal thoughts about Frederick Douglass?
Frederick Douglass, a fine man. He and I have become good friends. He is well educated, which he has done mostly himself. He is an example of someone who doesn't take pity on his situation and expect somebody else to raise him up. He takes the bull by the horns and he does the work himself. And he's a good example of what I've talked about in the past, of people pulling themselves by their own bootstraps and not expect handouts from other people. And he is very zealous for the cause of emancipation. In fact, I have given him an assignment to go into the southern states to promote emancipation, but that won't happen because General Lee surrendered to General Grant 5 days ago on April 9th. Fine man. I really respect him a lot. Any other questions? Yes.
How and when did you first get interested in politics?
Well, how and when did I first get interested in politics? I think it may have been when I was hauled into court in Kentucky for operating a raft boat without a license. You see, what had happened is I had built this raft. I was building this raft, and these two gentlemen hired me to take them out to the steamboat that was out in the middle of the Ohio River. And I did that. And to my surprise, they gave me $1. Now, I had heard of people earning $1 for a day's wage. And here I had earned $1 and I had not worked a full day. That just opened up a whole new world for me. And, but somebody complained and took me to court saying, in Kentucky, saying that I did not have a license to ferry people across the Ohio River. And I stood up for myself before the judge and I said, well, that steamboat was in the middle of the river. I won my case. And that got me interested in law. And then, when I was living in New Salem, I came to be known as someone that could help settle disputes between people. And I became very popular for being honest, fair with people. And so they elected me to the state legislature, and that kind of got things going. And I served 4 terms there, and that's where I met John Todd Stewart. He was a lawyer from Springfield. And he came to me one day and he said, Lincoln, I've been thinking, you'd make a good lawyer. How about if you study the law? I said, well, yes, I'd like to do that, but I have no money to go to law school, and I've got only 1 year of school, and how am I going to study the law? So he goes to his bookshelf, and he grabs a handful of books, and he shoves them at me. He says, here, study these. Read these over and over and over until you understand every word in them. And then when you get done with those, come back and get some more. And I did. And after 3 years, I got a license to practice law. And then, of course, over time, people encouraged me to run for Congress and so on and so forth. That's kind of how we got started. Any other questions? Yes?
What became of your step-siblings?
Well, Matilda got married. Elizabeth got married. John got married, but he's lazier than a pit coon. He would write letters to me, asking me to send him money to help him pay his bills. And every time he did that, I'd write him back and I said, John, get a job. Earn the money first, then spend it. Does that make sense? Yeah. You know, they got married and had families and lived their lives, farmed and so on. Nothing special. Usual. Any other questions? Yes.
Would you mind talking about your own children?
No, I don't mind talking about them. I have 4. Well, we had 4. Robert's the oldest, named after Mary's father, Robert Todd. And our second boy we named Eddie, after my good friend Eddie Baker. But sadly, Eddie did not live to see his 4th birthday. He suffered from consumption. He lay ill for 52 days before he gave up to go, so it was a very, very difficult time. That was in February of 1850, and then later that year our 3rd son, Willie, was born, and then our 4th boy we named Thomas, after my father, Thomas Lincoln, but we hardly ever call him Thomas. You see, when he was born, he had a large head and a long, skinny body. First time I looked at it, the first thing I thought of was a tadpole. So we nicknamed him Tadpole, and we called him Tad ever since. Now Robert, he was rather aloof. He'd run away from home sometimes. Willie and Tad, they became best friends and playmates, mischief makers. They did a lot of scrapping. I remember one time I was walking with them down the street, and the two boys are wailing and crying and carrying on, and a passerby stopped and asked what the problem was, and I said, well, I have 3 walnuts in my hand, and each of them wants 2. You've never had that problem. See. And then, on one occasion, I took them to my law office with me. Billy Herndon was my partner by this time, and they decided they were going to play stickball with a broomstick and an ink bottle. Yeah. Billy wanted to wring their necks. But Robert eventually went to Harvard Law School. He graduated, and he wanted desperately to join the Army. His mother did not want him to join the Army because Eddie was dead. By now, Willie was also dead. He had died of typhoid fever, age 11 years, into the White House. She has not recovered from that yet. And so she desperately did not want Robert to join the Army, thinking we don't need to lose 3 sons. So I wrote a letter to General Grant asking if he could find a spot for him not near the front lines. And so he put him on his staff, made him a captain. And Tad has a learning disability. He's 11 years old, and he doesn't read very well. Doesn't speak very well either. He has a bit of a lisp. It's hard for people to understand him. But he's a good boy, and he misses his brother terribly. Now, I could go on for hours, tell stories about the boys, but I think Mary wants you to get home. So I thank you very kindly for your attention this evening. And carry on diligently with the work ahead of us. With this war, with the fighting over now, the hard part begins. That is bringing our states back together into normal relations with one another, healing the hearts and minds of our families and friends who have been split all of these years. And sadly, I fear that some will go to their graves with that anger and hatred still in their hearts for the other side. But we must accept the challenge to make things better, and to get along and work together to make this the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Thank you much.